Okay, we're beginning the book of, or now we're in the book of Mark. We're looking at this great voyage that the uh, disciples have gone on. The Lord had told them, let's cast out to the other side. The Lord always took command of the boat. He told them where to go. But we noticed that they went to the storm, and now we're going to see that they're going through another storm, but it's a storm they cannot see. It's a demonic storm, and it's really what the lowest levels of humanity that we can see when Satan totally takes over. His forces totally takes over a person or a soul. And so we'll begin reading in verse 1 of chapter 5. Then they came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gadarenes. And when he had come out of the boat, immediately there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit, who was dwelling among the tombs, and no one could bind him, not even with chains, because he had often been bound with shackles and chains, and the chains had been pulled apart by him, and the shackles broken in pieces. Neither could anyone tame him. And always, night and day, he was in the mountains and in the tombs, crying out and cutting himself with stones. And when he saw Jesus from afar, he ran and worshipped him. And he cried out with a loud voice, "What have I to do with you, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I implore you, by God, that you do not torment me." And he said to him, "Come out of the man, unclean spirit." Then he asked him, "What is your name?" And he answered and said, "My name is Legion, for we are many." Also he begged him earnestly that he would not send him out of the country. Now a large herd of swine was feeding there near the mountain. So all the demons begged him, saying, "Send us into the swine that we may enter them." And at once Jesus gave them permission. Then the unclean spirits went out and entered the swine. There were about 2,000. And the herd ran violently down the steep place into the sea and drowned in the sea. So those who fed the swine fled, and they told it in the city and in the country. And they went out to see what was that had happened. Then they came to Jesus and saw the one who had been demon-possessed and had the legion sitting and clothed and in his right mind. And they were afraid. And those who saw it told them how it happened to him who had been demon-possessed and about the swine. Then they began to plead with him to depart from their region. And when he got into the boat, he who had been demon-possessed begged him that he might be with him. However, Jesus did not permit him, but said to him, "Go to your friends, tell them what great things the Lord has done for you, and how he has been compassionate on you." And he departed and began to proclaim in Decapolis all that Jesus had told him, and all marveled. So we see now that in this passage we see a man who is totally controlled by Satan. We see demonic activity. We see it in the sense that we understand what's going on, but visually we do not see it. And the Lord had told these disciples, don't forget, he was leading them. He led them into the storm. He said, "Let us go to the other side." He knew the storm was coming. And he also knew what he could do to remedy it. And it was a great teaching experience for the disciples, or a learning experience for them, as they found that who is he who can calm the waters? And now they're going and they're seeing this wild man, and they might be hearing, we don't know exactly, but the Lord saw the demons, and the demons knew the Lord. But I think the disciples were sitting there going, "What in the world is going on?" You'll notice that you can't tell who is speaking at times. Is it the demon-possessed man, or is it the demon? And so we see that the Lord knows what's going on here in this passage. So first of all, we notice the confrontation, the condition of the man. This is the epitome of what Satan can do. Notice he dwelt among tombs. There was something, a morbid desire to be around death and weirdness. One of the things that bothers me today is that the more that our country and the more that our society and our families turn away from the Lord, the more that we see a desire to be around the macabre, the death, the empty tombs, or the crypt. I think there was a whole series about the tales of the crypt or whatever. These weird things about death and the afterlife and all these things that man cannot see but has a morbid interest in. And then if you go to Barnes and Noble, I was in there with my wife over the Christmas holidays, and I was just astounded at all the books that deal with spiritism and all the ones that get off into the spirit world and the fantasies and so much of it that goes into things that cannot be seen, and yet it's brought out as real. And much of it, unfortunately, may be real, or at least we see that what is real and what isn't. And so we see that he dwelt among the dead. He wanted to be, there was something about, there's a way that seems right unto man, but the ends thereof are the ways of death. Or in other words, there's something, when a man goes toward the outside of the will of God, he has a tendency to like death. One of the things, I read a book a few years ago, it was about subliminal advertising. And they talked about the cigarette. Back then, they could advertise in magazines and television or whatever, but also, especially with alcohol. And what they would do with alcohol, they would take, and they would tell you the book they would give illustrations, and you would look at that advertisement that came out of a magazine or whatever, and let your eyes wander. And then they would tell you what to look for. And all of a sudden you could see skulls in the ice cubes. And there were just all kinds of things where they wanted to draw you in, and subliminally alcohol and death and destruction and all that. And then of course you could think of drugs and whatever they could do with that. But it's interesting how even advertisers know how to go after and kind of draw out the ways that it leads to death in a man. And of course they could do it with not only alcohol, but many other things that would be quite legitimate. But there's something about the human nature that is attracted. We know now that the second most expensive holiday, the one that's been on more than any other than Christmas, it used to be Easter, of course. You know, you'd have people going to church at least twice a year, but now people don't go to church at all. But the second most holiday or event in the year is Halloween. And all the money that is poured into the macabre, into the skulls and the skeletons and the witches and all these things. And there's just something about that. Go out to San Francisco, or go down to Chicago, or go to any place where there is a hotbed of people who have intentionally turned away from God. And you'll see so many of these, not totally there yet, like this man was, but they're getting there. And it leads to death. It leads to this epitome. This man was the epitome of demon possession, and who had given himself totally over to Satan. And so we see that he was in bondage, and he had supernatural powers. I mean, this guy could do things. Now, I'm not saying that a demon-possessed person has supernatural powers, but at times we see that there are some weird things that people can do, and even in the name of Satan. There have been, as you look at some of the rock stars and Hollywood's full of it, and people that they could claim great fame and do wonders as far as drawing people into their little net. And they have tremendous abilities to attract and attract to bondage, like they're in bondage. And we see that there again. I'm not saying that everybody that's in Hollywood, or I'm not saying, I don't want to get into this, a demon behind every bush, and and a witch coming to town every week or whatever. You'll notice that this was a very brief visit. The Lord exposed them to what was out there, but he didn't keep them there. And that's the way it is in society. I don't want to be around, and I don't want to be the authority on demonism. There's too many other things to be attracted to. And of course, I am resolved no longer to linger, charmed by the world's delights. Things that are higher, things that are nobler, these have attracted my sight. And that's what we want in life. And so, yes, we have to deal with it. And we want to know what we're dealing with when we deal with it. But at the same time, we don't want to stay there. It's a brief visit and let's get out. But here we see that there was bondage, supernatural forces. He was a danger to himself. Notice the self-mutilation and the cutting himself with stones and the tattoos and whatever else he had on him. And this is, again, you'll notice that is part of people that get deep into the occults and the self-altering, whether it's, I think a lot of this transgenderism is satanic. There again, I'm not saying that there's a demon-possessed physician or whatever, but a lot of this, it shows that it sure is attractive. If you turn away from God, then Satan has got a great way of attracting you to his way of doing things. And so we see that he was a danger to himself. Notice Luke chapter 8, verse 27 tells us, in the parallel passage, tells us that he was naked. So he ran around weird, eerie, violent, just a messed up guy. I don't think, he wasn't attractive. And you look at some of these parades that go on, and they pretty well doll up or mutilate themselves or whatever else. And they're not very attractive, even though they now are really getting into indecency and so forth. And so I don't want to get too deep into that myself, but but I don't like going. I don't want to go to some of these parades that are part of those who reject God. And so we see that he was naked. Not only was he a danger to himself, but he was a danger to others. Again, Luke tells us that people didn't want to be around him. They didn't want to be close to him. Of course, they tried to bind him and try to control him, and he had power enough to break them. I don't want to be around people like that. I don't know about you. But again, we see that he had some real problems in life. He was a violent type of person. And he could not control himself. Now, I'm not sure he does that all the time. We know that he was miserable because he was crying out among the tombs. And again, it's not a picture of a happy man, is it? He could tell he's happy, but all he's looking for is the next, fix, whatever it is. And so this man who is controlled by inner beings. Now, we have to be careful because we have a lot of people that are troubled. A lot of people, and there's a big, I had to be careful. Early in my ministry, there was people that wanted to study, and they really got off into studying demonism. This is back in the early 80s. And there were a couple of men who really made them name for themselves but for being an authority on demonic activity in the United States. But they started getting so eerie and so forth, and they were getting too deep into things it's a thing as a pastor, you have to be careful, or as a spiritual leader, you have to be careful that when you preach against sin, that you don't preach against it so strongly that you make it attractive to the very people that you're wanting to reject it. I've seen and I've heard evangelists speaking to teenagers about morality And they make it so graphic that the teachers say, yeah, I didn't know anything about that. And so we have to be careful that we don't excite the imagination by the very things that we're against, or that we say they were against. And by the way, a couple of those men who were off into it really were off into it. And that's the sad thing about it. That's the reason I don't want to study demonic activity, because I know of its power, but I don't want to know its power. I hope you understand that. I don't want to experience demonic activity. I think sometimes I can see it, and sometimes I wonder about it, and sometimes I know that whatever they're doing, they're rejecting God, whatever degree of satanic control there is. I just know that I want to stay away from it. But because I don't want to be an authority, and I definitely don't want to be one who has experienced and learned how to overcome it. Now you say, have you ever exorcised demons? I don't think so, but at the same time, I don't know. There was another pastor who got off into this, and he was more of the flamboyant kind, and he was a real rounder. But he made a real name for himself, because he even had on his tag, and down in Alabama, you didn't have to have a tag on your front bumper like you do up here, but he had a Devil Stomper on it, and it was a Z28 Camaro and all that. I mean, this guy was flamboyant. And the more I heard him, and one time I was at a funeral where I heard him preach a guy into heaven simply because that he could tell by the spirits, or what, I don't, it was, and when I went out, I just glared at him. I didn't even shake his hand. What a false prophet, what a phony he was. And I just, I want to stay away from that. And at the same time, I want to warn us against it. We don't want to be a part of it. Notice how that these disciples were sitting back. Notice how the disciples aren't even named. They went over, and the last time you see them is that they went over and they got out of the boat. But then the demon-possessed man met him and not the disciples. So they're in the background. They're watching this. And so the Lord is exposing them to some things, but he's not getting them totally involved in it. He's just showing them, as we've seen, whatever the Lord does, whenever he heals someone, he showed that he had power over creation and over the body. When he calmed the seas, he showed that he had power over the elements of creation. And so whatever he did, whatever miracle the Lord did, he was always demonstrating his omnipotence and his omniscience and his over the creation that he had made, that he had created. And so we see that now he is in direct control of what's going on. And we see that this man who is now totally hopeless, and we have this split personality all of a sudden. We see him coming, and when he saw Jesus, he came and worshiped him. Now that word worship is he came and he submitted. I mean, he was scared. And we see that they were scared. 3 times you'll see the word begged. You'll see that in this passage, you'll see that the demons begged the Lord. You'll see that the crowd begged the Lord. And you'll see that the converted man begged the Lord. And so there's 3 times that you see the word begged, or a very strong synonym to it, here in this passage. And so notice when he saw Jesus afar off, he came, and he was drawn to him. That tells us that the Spirit activity, we know the Holy Spirit, no man can come to the Father except the Spirit draw him. So we see there's a spiritual activity where the Lord is actually drawing this man to himself. And yet, boy, can you imagine being torn, the forces between the Holy Spirit and the evil spirits. And the Lord working in this man's heart, and yet these demons had control over him. And this is what we see whenever a person is fighting the Lord and not wanting to be saved, and yet wanting to be saved. They're attracted to it, and yet they aren't attracted to it. They are repulsed by it, and yet there's something that draws them to it. And of course, fightings and fears within, without. Oh Lord, I come. And so we see that's what happens with the natural and the supernatural, when the idea we want to see God, but we don't want to see God. The spiritual activity and the warfare that's going on, the flesh against the spirit and the spirit against the flesh. And so we see that Satan's forces are, for one thing, notice now as he goes in verse 6, and when he saw Jesus from afar, he ran and worshiped him. And he cried out with a loud voice. He said, "What do I have to do with you, Jesus, Son of the Most High God?" Now, who told him that Jesus was God? Who told him that he was the Son of the Most High God? Satan knows there's a God, and he trembles. So these demonic forces inside knew who they were fighting against, even though the man might not have known who he was fighting against. That's the weird thing about it. That's the reason you can't get too deep into it, because the forces are blurred and the identities are blurred. We know that Hitler came from an area of Germany that was Munich, and that area down there had a lot of demonic activity going on down there. And we get into the satanic forces, and people who dig into that see a lot of the occultism and so forth. I'm not sure that that Hitler and Satan never had a powwow, and the Lord and Satan told Hitler, "You just follow me and you'll take over the world." I don't know. I'm not saying any of that happened, but we do know that Satan really, there was a lot of satanic activity going into Germany, and the rejection of God. That was another thing. They in the 20s, there was a lot of disillusionment of religion in Germany. And people were actively rebelling against the Lord, and immorality was becoming rampant. And all kinds of the occultism was springing up all over Germany at that time. And I was looking at the Time Life books that they had on World War II, and one of the preludes to it. And these, Time Life is not known for its theological acumen, but they were just some of the things. In fact, some of the pictures there were just downright indecent that they had shown that were going on in the bar rooms and or the places. And by the way, where did Hitler get his start? He got it started in the beer halls. But all that was going on at the time. And of course, they were looking for a leader. They were disillusioned. They were angry. They were poor. Then the poorer they got, the more angry they got because they thought they deserved more. Does that sound kind of familiar, the direction that a large portion of our country is going in? And so they were looking for a leader. And they were looking for somebody that could concentrate their hate on somebody. And of course, that's what, look at the anger. The more that we turn away from God, we're miserable, we're angry, we're mutilating ourselves, we're leading paths of self-destruction as a society. Oh, are we demon-possessed? I don't know. I'm just saying that's a degree of, if you reject God, Satan will have a way of filling the void. And I'm not getting into all the things that Satan can do, and I'm not going to start naming demons and all those things. All I know is that Satan is alive and well on present earth. But so we see that they knew that he was God. And notice when they came in contact with God, notice he said, and he cried out with a loud voice, "I implore you," there's the word beg, "you by God, that you do not torment me." Now, wait a minute. Is this man talking or is this the demon talking? And so both of them knew that they were in trouble. They had met God. And folks, whenever we as a sinner come into the presence of God, whether it's the righteous men like Isaiah when he saw the Lord high and lifted up, and here he was a priest, and in the temple. And what did he do? He fell down and said, "Woe is me, for I'm undone." So even the godliest of men on earth realize when they come in contact with the Lord that they are sinners. see time and time again in the book of Revelation where John, after he saw all the awe-inspiring things that God did, he fell on his face as though dead, and he cried. He said, who am I to be up here watching all this? And so we see that even the most righteous men that we see, and they're all sinners, when they come in contact with the perfect God, they realize how unworthy they are. Just think of what the demons do when they come in contact with with God. And so it causes some problems. It causes some real chaos. And so who's speaking? I'll tell you in about 50 years when I'm up there with the Lord and he can tell me. I can't separate them. Who is who? And that's the danger of demonic activity. When he takes over, then he uses people. And like one guy said, I know he uses my mother-in-law. I think I saw her come to town on a broom. No. But that's those old mother-in-law jokes. My mother-in-law was one of the most godly people I ever knew, so I would not be able to identify with that. But just all these different things that people say, out of nowhere. But there again, witchcraft activity, and we laugh at it. I know that in my early ministry, we would have things on Halloween and go to the haunted places and so forth and have haunted houses. But across the board, in most Christian areas now, we realize that was a mistake because like I was talking to one guy we went to, and it was one of the best I'd ever been to, one of these little haunted woods. And he said, and I went there and he said, you really did a good job with that. And then you had the gospel afterwards and everything. And why did you quit? And he said, because we were having people coming out and it became real. And we were having people that were coming out with and having seances in our woods. And he said, we just closed the whole thing off. I'm going, oh. And today, folks, we pass out candy during Halloween and so forth. But, we stay away from the macabre. We stay away from, we're not going to put skulls and crossbones and all that. If it's an opportunity when kids are out on the street and invite them to church, then give them a piece of candy and ask them to be in church. But, I don't know. What do you do with that? Personally, we don't have any things at our house. You turn on the light if you have candy for the kids. I've thought about what to do there. But it's again one of those areas where I'm not going to give a blanket rule. It's a principle. Maybe in your neighborhood you better stay away from it. And in other neighborhoods it's whatever. But stay away from make it a time of testimony for the Lord. If you're going to do anything. And so we see that, and we can get into a discussion there, but of course this is not the purpose for that right now. But so notice they implored him, they begged him, and notice he said, "Come out from out of the man, unclean spirit." So now the Lord is not talking to the man. Now the Lord later on will talk to the man, but he's talking to who's controlling the man. He says, "Come out of him, you unclean spirit." And then the Lord really pinpoints, "What's your name?" Identification. He knows he's talking to a spokesman. He knows he's talking to a principality or power or evil wickedness in high places. He knows that he's talking to an emissary of Satan who controls a lot of other. There's ranks of angels and there's ranks of demons. And so he says, "What's your name?" And he says, "My name is Legion, for we are many." In other words, I'm in control of thousands. A legion could be up to 6,000 or even more men. It just depended on whose army it was, but at least 6,000. Now, does that mean because all those 6,000 demons were in this one man? I doubt it. But at the same time, I don't know. And nobody else does either. And that's conjecture. The Lord does not tell us all the things that are going on, just like he didn't tell Job what was going on behind his back, or out there in the spirit world, in the conversation he was having with Satan. But notice, for we are many. And also notice he begged him again. So they begged him. And notice also he says, notice the pronouns. My name is Legion, for we are many. Also he begged him that he would not cast them out of the out into the country. So don't cast us out of the country. Um, is the idea of don't cast us, you know, out of the world, out of this sphere. And of course, and Luke brings it out a little stronger. Luke is written to the Greeks, and to the abyss. The Satan knows that sooner or later he's going to be destroyed, or that's what he thinks, because we know that that's another one of those things where how can we know what's going to happen at the end of Satan? And Satan keeps on fighting. If I was Satan, I would say, wait a minute, Lord, I made a big mistake. And is there any way that we could reconcile? But Satan, notice that God has given him over to this mind where he can't do that. And he just, the more that he is defeated, the more that he fights. And God allows him. Notice that Satan can't do anything more than what God allows. And so notice he's begging God to allow him to do certain things. And so he said, there's a bunch of swine out there. Now, this is where we get into the culture. The Gadarenes Gad was one of the tribes that was on the east side of the Jordan. If you remember, Reuben, Gad, and half tribe of Manasseh. And so does the name come from this? We do know that there had been a lot of activity and culture changes and tribal changes and nation changes all around that area. But it was still kind of the Gadarenes. Still had kind of an element of the name. And there were a lot of Jews mixed in with the Hellenistic or the Greeks and the Jews, and a multiculturalism, if you want to call it that. It was much like that in World War I, when the British were trying to keep the Germans from infiltrating Turkey and the Middle East. And of course, you know about, you've probably heard of Lawrence of Arabia and all those emissaries that were over there, the big diplomatic battles that were going on in World War I about the control of the Middle East. And the English wanted to pay a lot of farmers in this very area to, they needed bacon for their troops. They needed pork, anything that would grow. And one of the ones that would grow the best in that area were pigs. Wait a minute, both Muslims and Jews do not want to eat, if you know the problems there, if you know anything about the Muslim area over here. And so what they did was a lot of the English, or a lot of the Muslims and Jews who owned it, they would hire the Gentiles, or the non-Muslim and non-Jews, to raise the pigs for them. And guess who got the money? The Muslims and the Jews. And so we can't do it, but we could hire some people who can. And that sounds a lot like what's going on here. And so notice these guys, they ran into the town and told everybody about it. But the owners were out. And notice there was 2,000 pigs. That's a lot of ham. It's a lot of bacon. And notice they ran into the sea. Now, a lot of people think about that. They ran down and fell or like a bunch of lemmings and off into the sea. Can you imagine 2,000 animals dying at once in Lake Michigan? You think it would cause a little bit of a stink? You think the news would have something to say about it? Yuck. And all those rotten, or those that would take days for it to, but that was a very pleasant sight. And so this was economically, it was a disaster for whoever the owners were. And politically and every other way, it caused a lot of news to spread very quickly. Now, why did the Lord allow? Notice he allowed them. He said, okay, go ahead, jump into the pigs. For one thing, pigs were unclean. And the Jews should not be a part of that. So it was kind of a judgment if these were Jews that owned the pigs, but let other people take care of them. But it's another thing that Satan can control people because people have spirits. But Satan doesn't have as much control over animals. And because they don't have spirits. And there again, you get into, okay, then Satan control a dog or what? I don't, Only if God allows him to. But here we see that these poor old pigs, they didn't know what to do with what this man had endured. This one man had endured for years. They didn't know what to do with him for a second. And so they run off into the sea, self-destruction. Satan is always a destroyer, is he not? And these pigs destroyed themselves. And again, boy, how deep do you get into it? But and so we see the shepherds fled. They went into town, told everybody. And then we see the conversion of the man. Notice the three things that we see here. This man, when God got a hold of him, he was sitting at peace. Sitting at Jesus' feet is what Luke more specifically tells us. So yes, he came to worship him, but now he is sitting at his feet. He's at peace. Notice he's clothed. It's interesting. I've talked to missionaries, some very good missionaries. They say it's interesting. You come back to America, the culture shock, because the people in deepest, darkest Africa, when they get saved, or in South America, they want to put on clothes. But when you come back to America, the Christians who call themselves Christians want to throw off their clothes. And so it's kind of interesting how that clothing has a lot to do with godliness. Whenever the first revival in Scripture is where Jacob tells his sons, "Okay, guys, we got to get back to Bethel. Put away your foreign gods, change your clothes, and let's get back to Bethel." That was the place of the house of God, the place where God first met him. It's interesting. Just that's another little sidelight about clothing in the Bible. It has a lot to do with your demeanor. But then notice he was sane. He was in his right mind. Now, again, we can get off into, the psychology today, and we're getting too much into psychology and not enough in preaching. I know that there are people that are emotionally imbalanced, and I'm not saying that everyone, and many of us have people in our families or close friends that have had some major psychological problems. People who come back from war, and people who have been through some traumatic experiences, trauma. We know that happens. We know that sometimes children or people are born with an instability for whatever reasons. I'm not getting into saying, like that one thing I was going to tell you about, that preacher who had a lady who had visited my church, and I talked with her, and I met her, she was sitting on her porch, and she was crying. When I went there, she and her husband had visited with us, and she had gone to a pastor, and these people were very intelligent people. He worked for a major company and so forth, very, very well respected man. But she was asking, she said, and I asked her, you're troubled, and what's going on? And she started talking, and she said, I had this problem in my past, and I just seem like I can't get forgiveness from God. And I went to this evangelist, and I knew who the evangelist was. And he was preaching on this stuff back in the early 80s about demon possession, all this. And she started telling him her problems, how that she couldn't sense God's forgiveness. And the evangelist said, "You just must be demon possessed." And she asked me, she said, "Am I demon possessed?" And I said, "Even if you're asking that question, it tells me that you're probably not." And I led her out of that. And then I got with another evangelist who knew this evangelist, and I said, "We need to talk to this lady." And he said, "Lady, this guy is way off." And she and her husband became some most loyal members I've ever had in church. But we cause a lot of problems by saying things we have no authority to say. I'm not going to tell you, even if I think that you are being controlled by Satan. Sometimes I wonder about certain people. I'm not going to say, you're just demon possessed, because I don't know. I do know somebody's got a hold of you, and it's not God. But at the same time, stay away from that stuff of there's a demon behind every bush, because you can do a whole lot more damage than you can good. And so we see that he was sitting and he was on his right mind. So don't tell somebody who's got a child who they just cannot understand. I've had children come through. I think of another child that came through, and he was about 16 years old, and at the time I was a single guy, and he was out of it. And but he was, when I say out of it, he wasn't on drugs, but he was just spacey. And I found out who he was, and his mother, his adopted parents were in Arizona. And for some reason he told me, and I even, boy, this back, I wouldn't have done it if I was married and with kids, but I even let them stay in one of my spare bedrooms. I was living in a trailer. And I found a way to get him and his family back together. They were Christians, but he said, we adopted him as a child. And we have never been able to break through. There's something wrong with him, and he's done this several times. And we're so thankful to you that, that God put you in. So, I'm not being the hero or whatever. That's just what happened. But again, I'm not going to tell you that child was demon-possessed. I don't know what's going on with him. There's something about the human mind that who can know it? And so I'm not saying that if you have a friend or if you have a relative that has mental problems, that they're demon-possessed. Stay away from that. You can do more danger than good in those areas. So notice the idea, he's in his right mind. Notice the concern for the crowd. We have to close very quickly. When people get saved, other people that are unsaved get a little antsy. They don't want any part of it. And so hey, listen, you've caused too many problems. They were more scared of a converted man than they were of this insane man. Notice that. They were more concerned for a Christian than they were a person who was demon-possessed. They were used to the demon-possessed. They didn't know, hey, there's too much of a change here, and boy, look at all those pigs out there. What will we have to give up? And so, again, we have to close, but notice the commission. Then so notice that they were afraid and they begged him to leave. And now, by contrast, the convert, the man, begs him to go with the Lord. So it's interesting here. And of course, the Lord tells him to stay. Now, of course, the Lord is not going to tell him to do something that he didn't have the power to do. So he wasn't saying, he's not sending him back into the crowd. But notice this man came out of the tombs. He was not there anymore. But he went into the largest town around, Decapolis, which means, Deca means 10. It's an area of about 10 little villages around that area. And so he went into these villages, and he said, look what happened to me. Hey, listen, I used to be, Joe the Demoniac. But look what God's done for me. Now, of course, if God did that, God also provided the way for him to be strong. So we have to, oh boy, we have to close now. But maybe we'll finish up on this because we'll see that there's two other healings in this chapter. We have Jairus' daughter, who was raised from the dead, of all things. And then we have the woman with the issue of blood, which was, medically impossible. Okay, we're going to have to close. Let's pray. Father, thank you again for your blessings. Lord, use us for your glory. In Jesus' name, amen.